Okay, so if we could have some feedback from each of the tables. I'm going to start over here with agriculture. So if you could take the mic, whoever's going to report, and just some key interesting issues or points that you want to raise that came up from the discussion.
Okay, we had three main areas that we wanted to report back on. One was in relation to diet and food security from the UK's perspective, that UK production of high protein materials is relatively limited, that we don't have the right agricultural conditions for producing much in terms of high protein foods that isn't meat, and that therefore food security could be negatively impacted if we were to go to a more vegetarian, reduced meat environment, because lentils and so on are not suitable for production here. And there was a long discussion on peas and their susceptibility to climate to weather impacts. The second issue that we discussed at length was waste. There were big issues raised in that farm waste, before stuff gets to the farm gate, is a big, big unknown. There's the potential that there is huge wastage there. It was being suggested there weren't adequate records of stuff being plied back into the ground, and food that perhaps could be consumed, not being consumed because it's deemed unsuitable or inferior quality and therefore just not being used. And that we just don't know how big this waste issue is and what impact that has. And it's not just a loss issue. You then have methane and you have nitrogen going back into the ground as well, both of which can be then contribute further to the climate change problem. The third issue was more about the whole farming system and how entrenched it is and how we need to change that. And I'm going to hand over to my left for that.
Yeah, we were talking about, are we tinkering or actually trying to transform the food system? And we can't think about production or consumption either locally or nationally or globally. We have to look at that interconnectedly. And a question for the UK is, would it be better to reduce our ecological footprint by changing our diet, or seeing climate change as an opportunity to increase our exports with the current model of agriculture? What would be the bigger impact actually globally? And the other thing that we're still doing is exporting a Western dietary pattern and food system. And our businesses are very much advertising that globally, promoting dairy consumption in places it doesn't exist, building markets. And that is actually fundamentally something we need to question, especially when most food in the world is still produced by small farmers. What we're looking at is actually not a long-term model. So there's a big questions about transformation and the nature, and that we shouldn't link hunger with agriculture and food security, because we can eliminate hunger, and we could do that now, without any change in the agriculture and food security. They don't necessarily connect. That point was made also on the floor.
Thanks very much. So if we hand over to the emissions accounting table for some feedback. I think the discussion there maybe deviated away from emission accounting into some other areas. So just some key points that came up, please, Ellie. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, we didn't do a huge lot on emissions accounting, I'm afraid, but we did talk about how we would present the research more generally, and the gap between the research that we do, the industry, the policymakers and the public, and how we can bridge that gap, and the contribution that this report's made to some of that through the stakeholder engagement, but how we could use those kind of techniques in the future to look at more influencing behaviour and incentivising behaviour change in industry and with the public. And then the second point we talked about is the transition pathways, and how we can visualise these and gain wider engagement within these, using underlying trends and considering whether there is growth in things like vegetarianism and purchasing of corn products, for example, that we could use to incentivise these different behaviour changes, and putting these changes in place now for longer term gains, and using these longer term scenarios to help us with those, put us on the right kind of pathways. Does that cover everything?
Okay. Thanks very much. And then to the consumer table, who's feeding back there? Okay, thanks.
Hi. We spoke about trying to change behaviour, and I think we talked around what would be the policy things that we would want to sort of feedback. There was discussion around whether or not it should be a bottom-up or a top-down approach. So should we be trying to change what's available to consumers, or we should be educating consumers and encouraging them to make these changes? We had a bit of a debate around education, and I think we came to the conclusion that education is really important. We need to be sure that people understand what's good, bad, etc. Also, what to do with food. So if we're saying don't eat one product but eat another, will they know how to prepare it, etc. But from other fields, we know that education isn't enough. People can have the knowledge but don't choose to change their behaviour. Food's a very sort of social issue as well, so it's difficult to actually change behaviour. We discussed peer pressure, so could there be some change by trying to change what's happening amongst your peers? People want to fit in with what's happening, so that was another area. Also looking at leadership, who could take this forward and actually encourage behaviour change. And there was one discussion about changing supermarket layouts to try and encourage people to buy certain products, etc. I think that'll probably be quite a challenge to get the supermarkets to do something like that. And that brought on to some of the sort of conflicts and difficulties and tensions there may be between what environmentally, nutritionally we would like to see in the supermarkets and what's profitable. And then I think finally we also said there's no one solution. We need to have lots and lots of different solutions, but we also sort of thought that's also, we've got to be careful. The politicians don't just come back and we say, what are you going to do? And they say there's no one solution, we'll do lots of things, but won't actually tell you any one thing. So is that?
Okay, thanks, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for participating in the workshop. I'm just going to pull out a few things that sort of I've been hearing from what you've just been saying in terms of potential future research ideas. I think this issue around waste is really interesting. I think, we were looking at the full supply chain, we were quantifying the emissions associated with that supply chain. And obviously, if you do something at the consumer end, that also has an implication for the amount of waste you have at the production end. But I think that there's an awful lot of research that could be done around that, both in terms of qualitative and quantitative research, which ties in nicely to some of the work that's already been done at the SCI with David Evans. So that's really interesting that's come up here. This issue about the role of the UK, I think, opens up some new interesting research questions. So, it's linked to other food systems, its responsibility in some ways, maybe its influence in other ways, and the implications of using its land for production or changing its diets and so on. So, I think that's something that, again, throws up some interesting aspects to research. There was more talk as well about sort of quantifying how you might achieve some of these futures. We did some of this work. We looked at some of these pathways ourselves in more qualitative terms, but not only quantifying the emissions how they might change along the way, but also there was a discussion on the table in the middle there about the economic appraisal of it. So how can you look at the costs of these changes? Can you look at them in the longer term? And is that something that we should be focusing a little bit more on, trying to kind of, particularly if we want to engage in the policy debate, making sure that we have a good understanding of some of the economic implications, at least as we can define them, whilst also articulating the uncertainty associated with that. As far as we're concerned, there's an awful lot of research we think that could follow on from all of this work, and that we hope to be able to follow that up. And I just want to say something just in relation more generally to the role of the SCI in relation to research. And this doesn't apply necessarily to all the academics within the SCI, but I think that there is a strong role for the SCI as an intermediary that does robust academic research, but also has this communication element, particularly related to policy and engaging with policymakers. And I personally see this as a particular important aspect of our type of research that takes this kind of bigger picture, this more systemic outlook, and raises some of the questions, even if we don't have all the answers. But I do think it means that we're in a position where we have to be a bit bold about what our analysis is telling us, even when it's telling us things that actually we find quite uncomfortable, or when we say what our research is telling us, we get an uncomfortable response. Because we have to, if that's what our analysis is showing us, then we have to be outspoken about that, engage in those debates. And it might be that our analysis is not correct, but we need to get that debate going in order to determine, to get it unpicked even more and to find out, if we're along the right path, because there are some really obvious hotspots, if you like. I think John mentioned this on the table over there. That we know quite a lot about what we need to do. The trouble is that we're not able to convince the policymakers that we need to do these things for certain levels of climate change. So I think as SCI researchers and this sort of research, I think we need to be more confident in our results and not to be shying away from going against the orthodoxy if that's what our research is saying that we need to get engaged with in terms of our debate. So that's just how I'd like to finish. I want to thank you very much, and I'm just going to hand over to Rod just to say a few final words.
Okay, thanks very much, Alice. I don't want to add very much, except if I put my institutional hat on rather than my SCI hat, I would very much endorse what Alice just said. When you're working in this kind of area, you're treading an extremely delicate line between the conventional norms of research and feeding into evidence-based policy as the neutral arbiter of facts, versus, on the other hand, actually using the individual academic's academic freedom quite properly to link their view of their research to their view of the policy questions and to take a stance on those policy questions. And there is quite a distinction, of course, between what the individual academic has license to do there and what the institution can or should not endorse. So I would defend to the death Alice's right to draw whatever policy conclusions she wants to draw from her research and be as vigorous as she wishes in pursuing those policy objectives publicly in any policy forum. But of course, she can only do that if the evidence base from which she's working is produced to the highest standards of the University of Manchester and of the rest of the scientific community. I know that to be the case, and therefore I congratulate the team on having walked that delicate line extremely well and produced some extremely strong evidence, but also some very challenging policy issues for us to discuss. So I'd like to congratulate the team. Thank you very much for all coming and invite you to have lunch with us. Thanks very much.